Introduction: The World of Medieval Hygiene. Hey guys, tonight we begin not with a battle or a banquet, but with the very personal, very pungent world of medieval hygiene. We're stepping into a time when people feared bathing more than plague, when garlic could double as perfume, and when your neighbor might literally throw strange things out the window and call it normal. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments. Daily cleaning and bathing rituals in the Middle Ages. Back then, people commonly washed their hands, faces, and feet with cloths and herbal rinses, but a full body soak became rare, reserved for the very wealthy, the dangerously brave, or the terminally itchy. Yes, medieval people feared bathing, but not because they were lazy or ignorant. They were trying to stay healthy in their own 14th century way. Unfortunately, without germ theory, indoor plumbing, or a basic grasp of microbiology, their strategy was more about paranoia than real prevention. There was a time when bathing was more accepted, but eventually even that was called into question. The church wasn't banning hygiene outright, just making it incredibly difficult to achieve. The Golden Age of Dry Cleaning and Church Influence. Thus began the Golden Age of dry cleaning, medieval style. Soap became optional, water became suspicious, and the bathhouse became just another relic from a time when scrubbing didn't come with consequences. Despite the church's growing horror at naked elbows and the widespread belief that a hot bath could let the plague in through your pores, medieval people didn't complain much. They simply adapted to the next best thing, the humble sponge bath. They didn't really have soft, mass-produced sponges like today. Instead, they used linen cloths soaked in warm water, herbs, or vinegar, wiping themselves down as if buffing a stain from a very delicate chair. Hygiene in this context meant dabbing. If you were lucky, someone else did it for you. If you were noble, someone else did it reluctantly. These partial washes, sometimes using lye and animal fat, were great for cutting grease and, if used too often, for stripping your scalp. Paired with water of dubious quality, you'd have yourself a medieval chemical peel. Oral care and perfume. For those hoping to preserve their follicles a little longer, egg yolks were sometimes used as a gentler cleanser. Imagine sitting in a freezing hut, raw eggs sliding down your neck as you try to convince yourself this is nourishing. Others rinsed with beer, which, if nothing else, left hair compostable and weirdly bark-flavored. To freshen breath, people chewed fennel seeds, cloves, or cardamom, whatever they could afford or swipe from the spice rack. Among the wealthy, you might rinse your mouth with vinegar, wine, or even myrrh water, because nothing says dental sophistication like gargling a liquid also used to embalm pharaohs. And if you're wondering about toothpaste, it did sort of exist. Some recipes included powdered charcoal, crushed eggshells, and oyster shells. Some people put rosemary or marjoram directly into their hair. Hygiene, fashion, and spiritual pest control all mixed together. For those with coin, perfume was imported from the Middle East or Italy, made from rose oil or civet, extracted from the rear end of a very surprised, cat-like animal. Applying it involved dabbing, waving, and pretending you weren't just masking the stench of boiled turnips and regret. Environmental smells, clothing, and the world of insects. And then there were the environmental smells, open sewers, livestock, candle smoke, and waste, all seen as suspicious or even dangerous. You were expected to sweat, stink, and let the body cleanse itself. You weren't unclean, you were just medically fragrant. Then came the problem of fashion. Layers upon layers of wool, linen, and fur trapped heat and moisture like a mobile greenhouse. Add open fires, feasting, and the occasional plague, and you had yourself a sensory experience worthy of a full-blown evacuation. But you weren't alone. Everyone around you smelled too. Laundry was often done by beating fabric on rocks and hoping the river didn't sweep it away. But even this was easier than bathing yourself or dealing with the spiritual consequences of baring your chest to a tub of warm water. If there was one thing truly consistent in the medieval hygiene routine, it was itching. Not because people were allergic to linen or hay, though, let's be honest, probably that too, but because they were constantly playing host to a traveling circus of lice, fleas, and mites. Lice were a fact of life, managed by improvisation and lowered expectations. Toilets, public bathhouses, and laundry life. Let's start with the elite. Castles had guardrobes, basically closets with a hole in a stone bench that dropped straight down, sometimes into a moat, sometimes into a pit, and occasionally into a patch of earth someone forgot to fence off. These were often located high in towers for privacy and the added thrill of gravity. If you were below one, you learned quickly not to loiter. Peasants, on the other hand, had few choices. Public bathhouses were called stews, not because you sat in them too long, but because of the steamy water. Mixed-gender bathing wasn't unheard of, especially in Germany or Italy, where attitudes were a bit more relaxed. Families could attend together. Monks sometimes bathed in pairs. But human nature being what it is, boundaries got murky. So did the water. Naturally, this made bathhouses a favorite target for the church. Clerics warned of moral dangers lurking in the steam, and eventually, bathhouses faded from daily life. Mostly, everything just smelled like damp campfire and disappointment. Soap was mainly used for laundry and heavy-duty scrubbing, not so much for the body, at least not casually. Skin was considered delicate, and lye soap could turn a bath into a mild chemical burn. Still, people used it when necessary, especially before special events like weddings, court appearances, or plague outbreaks. More refined soaps came from the Islamic world and Italy. Clothes were often spread across bushes, hedges, or lines between trees and peasant huts. Medieval villages had the charming aesthetic of a never-ending yard sale. Not everyone did their own laundry. Wealthy households had servants, monasteries had lay brothers, and some towns even had professional washers. But for most people, it was a hands-on task. The social meaning of hygiene and a medieval wrap-up. Though their standards were, let's say, fluid, they weren't without effort. Hygiene was more of a social signal than a science. Clean clothes equaled virtue. Shiny hair, or at least less itchy hair, meant discipline. Avoiding full body rot was simply good manners. In the end, medieval hygiene worked in the same way that balancing a wagon wheel with twine works. Barely, but impressively, considering the tools at hand. The ancient world, city planning and civilization. In city over 4,000 years ago, the ancient jewel of the Indus, with intent, intelligence, and a disturbing awareness that clean water and zoning laws actually matter. And they didn't even have an urban planning department. Go figure. If Mohenjo-Daro was the tidy accountant of ancient cities, Babylon was the theatrical celebrity. Flashy, vast, and drenched in myth, Babylon wasn't just a city, it was a symbol. Babylon rose and fell many times over the centuries, but in its prime around the 6th century BCE, under Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon was the glittering heart of the world. To some, it probably felt a bit underwhelming. Roughly 1,000 years before the Aztecs marveled at its ruins and named it Teotihuacan, the place where gods were born, this ancient Mexican city was already flexing its urban design skills. At its peak, around 500 CE, Teotihuacan was one of the largest cities in the world, with a population north of 100,000. Unlike the chaotic sprawl of some modern megacities, this place was deliberately mapped out with the precision of a sacred geometry student. When we talk about ancient urban planning, it's tempting to imagine a single mastermind, the ancient version of a city architect with a scroll and a vision. But in the Indus Valley civilization, it seems the planning came not from a ruler's decree, but from a cultural consensus so strong that multiple cities across the region, from Harappa to Lothal, share shockingly similar features. These weren't sister cities, they were practically architectural clones, and that says something profound. Modern cities may have residents arguing over parking permits and whether someone's Airbnb violates residential codes. But zoning, dividing a city into designated areas for living, working, worshiping, and dumping your garbage, isn't modern. It's ancient and surprisingly widespread. Cities like Mohenjo-Daro, Babylon, and Teotihuacan weren't just random clusters of buildings. They were carefully orchestrated spaces, each with a logic behind the layout. Let's start with Mohenjo-Daro again. There, the raised citadel housed public buildings, amber pots, and the unmistakable perfume of unwashed crowds. But the truth is, some ancient cities cared a lot about sanitation. In fact, several had public hygiene systems that would make a 19th century European blush. Let's return to Mohenjo-Daro, our sanitation superstar. Nearly every house, regardless of size, had its own private bathing area, complete with a sloped floor to drain water. Wastewater was channeled into covered street drains. Yes, covered drains. Lined with bricks and fitted with manholes, the kind you still see today. The marketplace, temples, and social order. Every ancient city we've explored so far had a beating economic heart, and that heart pulsed in the form of carefully planned marketplaces, trade routes, and economic zoning. In Babylon, markets were not a chaotic afterthought squeezed between temples. They were institutionalized, woven into the urban grid, and regulated by law. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest known legal texts, devotes dozens of clauses to market rules. But ancient city planning wasn't just about sewage systems and shopping districts. It was about the gods. Temples weren't hidden in quiet corners. They dominated skylines, sat atop the city's highest points, and demanded prime real estate. If markets were the city's heartbeat, temples were its soul, and ancient planners made sure everyone knew it. Start with Babylon. The skyline was pierced by the Etemenanke ziggurat, a multi-tiered mountain of baked brick dedicated to the god Marduk. It was no modest monument. They didn't have modern blueprints and civil engineering degrees. But dig a little deeper, literally, and you'll find that the bones of urban life were laid thousands of years ago by planners without concrete, bulldozers, or CAD software. The DNA of city planning, grids, zoning, sanitation, civic centers, religious spaces, was already etched into the earth by people we often underestimate. Take drainage. Mohenjo-Daro didn't just throw down a few ditches. They designed an integrated, multi-level wastewater system. The Roman Empire. Hadrian's story. On the distant western fringe of the Roman Empire, Hadrian was born in 76 CE in Italica, a Romanized town in the province of Hispania Baetica, modern-day southern Spain. Though geographically far from the capital, Hadrian's family was anything but provincial. They were wealthy, elite, and thoroughly Roman in culture and ambition. Most importantly, his father's side was related by blood to Marcus Ulpius Trajanus, the man who would later become Emperor Trajan. Hadrian lost both his parents at an early age, but he inherited not just their wealth, but their connections. Hadrian's path to the throne wasn't universally accepted. Trajan had never publicly named a successor, and the political elite were divided over whether Hadrian, the aloof intellectual from Hispania, was truly the right man to lead Rome. Trajan died in Selinus in Asia Minor, far from the capital. Conveniently or suspiciously, within days, a letter arrived in Rome stating that Trajan had adopted Hadrian as his son on his deathbed, witnessed by Trajan's wife Plotina and the ever-loyal Aetianus. The timing was, to say the least, convenient. From the moment he secured his throne, Hadrian set out on a mission to visit nearly every province under his control. It wasn't ceremonial. It was hands-on governance, inspection, correction, diplomacy, and vision, all wrapped in sandals and sweat. Over the next 2 decades, Hadrian would log more miles than any emperor before or after him. His first major tour began in 121 CE and lasted nearly 5 years. He traveled through Gaul, Germania, Britannia, Hispania, and the rest of the empire. Hadrian left behind arches, aqueducts, baths, theaters, and temples, not just as monuments, but as blueprints for a unified empire. Perhaps his most iconic contribution within Rome itself was the Pantheon, rebuilt under his orders around 126 CE. While Agrippa's earlier version had burned down, Hadrian's vision transformed it into one of the most enduring buildings in history. With its massive dome and oculus, the Pantheon became a marvel of Roman engineering and a symbol of the heart of the empire. Hadrian, Antinous, and Power's Paradox. Described in ancient sources as stunningly handsome, quiet, and obedient, Antinous became Hadrian's favorite companion, accompanying him on journeys throughout the empire, especially in Greece and Egypt. Their relationship, while never officially defined, was widely understood to be romantic. In a society where emperors often wielded absolute power over courtly relationships, Hadrian's bond with Antinous stood out for its intensity and visibility. But in 130 CE, tragedy struck. While traveling along the Nile, Antinous drowned under mysterious circumstances. Hadrian was devastated, and in his grief he founded cities, coins, and temples in Antinous' honor, cementing his memory forever in stone. Hadrian's reign was calm by comparison, but beneath it lay authoritarian reflexes, the executions of senators, the crushing of the Bar Kokhba revolt, the exile of dissenters. These revealed a man who preached moderation, but wielded authority with surgical ruthlessness when challenged. Privately, Hadrian was introspective and melancholic. His poetry, especially late in life, reflected the fragility of life and the limits of power. As his body failed, he still had one final imperial duty: naming a successor. Hadrian had no biological children, and his political instincts were clouded by personal affection. In 136 CE, he adopted Lucius Saonius Commodus, known as Lucius Aelius Caesar, a relatively obscure senator with a reputation for charm but poor health. Many were puzzled. The man was stylish, possibly soft, and clearly not built to rule. But Hadrian's legacy wasn't only made of stone. It was also etched in policy and precedent. He reformed Roman law, reorganized the military without constant warfare, and left behind a villa at Tivoli that became the model for Renaissance palaces centuries later. Hadrian embodied the paradoxes of power, both adored and feared, elegant, yet cruel when provoked. The Lewis and Clark Expedition, across a continent. Lewis and Clark brought military discipline, cartographic skill, and an easy rapport with their men, a balance President Jefferson believed essential. They would be equal leaders, despite only Lewis holding a formal commission. Their unity would become one of the expedition's greatest strengths. Preparations began immediately. Jefferson provided detailed instructions: observe the landscape, establish trade with native tribes, study plant and animal life, and assert American presence in lands already claimed by others. The team quickly fell into a disciplined routine. Clark, ever the cartographer, mapped every bend in the river. Lewis, the naturalist, cataloged flora, fauna, and geological features, collecting samples and describing everything from catfish to mosquitoes with obsessive detail. Every day they encountered new creatures, some majestic like bald eagles and elk, others less welcome, gnats, ticks, and biting flies. At Fort Mandan, their winter shelter, made from rough wood logs, the fort featured high walls, blockhouses, and cramped rooms for over 30 men. It was more drafty than comfortable. But it kept the howling winds at bay, and those winds were merciless. Temperatures often plunged below zero. Frostbite was a daily threat. Yet life inside Fort Mandan was far from idle. Lewis and Clark were obsessively recording data, everything from temperature readings to tribal languages to the exact number of corn kernels in a local cob. Sacagawea was a stabilizing force, cool under pressure, adaptable, and fiercely capable. By June, the Corps reached the Great Falls of the Missouri. Not one, but a series of 5 waterfalls stretching across 18 miles. It was a magnificent natural wonder and an absolute nightmare to portage. The men spent nearly a month hauling boats and supplies overland around steep cliffs and jagged terrain, using homemade carts and brute strength. Some called it the expedition's most physically grueling challenge. Winter in the Bitterroots tested them further. Days spent hiking through snowdrifts while gnawing on boiled roots and shredded hides. Clark wrote that they were entirely out of provisions and subsisting on horse meat. It was the lowest point of the journey, yet somehow they didn't give up. When they emerged from the mountains near present-day Idaho, the Corps stumbled into the lands of the Nez Perce tribe. The Nez Perce could have easily wiped them out, but instead, they nursed the starving men back to health, offering fish and friendship. Hardship, hospitality, and enduring legacy. The environment transformed. Rain fell with merciless regularity. The lush forests of what is now Washington and Oregon were beautiful, but cold, damp, and utterly relentless. Clothing molded, gunpowder became unreliable. The journals of Lewis and Clark during this period read like diaries from a soggy purgatory. Finally, in mid-November 1805, after 18 months of hardship, the Corps reached the mouth of the Columbia River. There, through the gray, stormy mist, they caught their first glimpse of the Pacific Ocean. But the coast brought new challenges, not friendly hospitality. Unlike the Mandan or Nez Perce, these coastal tribes expected reciprocity and didn't mind showing impatience when the Americans offered less than impressive trade goods. And then there was boredom. Trapped in a fort made of soggy logs, waiting for the weather to break, the men passed time making salt, mending clothes, and carving wooden souvenirs. Spirits ran low. Illness spread. Even Lewis, usually the steely-eyed scientist, grew irritable and withdrawn. In late July, Lewis's group encountered Blackfeet warriors, who initially appeared friendly, but grew suspicious when they saw the Americans' firearms and trade goods. One tense night turned deadly. A skirmish broke out, and 2 Blackfeet men were killed, the only violent deaths caused by the expedition. Lewis's party fled under cover of darkness, shaken and wounded. Clark's group had a slightly less dangerous encounter and returned safely. The expedition's legacy lived on. Clark named his firstborn son Meriwether Lewis Clark, a tribute to his fallen friend and partner. And what of Sacagawea and York? Sacagawea returned west with her husband and child. Her exact fate is debated, but her symbolic role in American memory only grew. York, Clark's enslaved servant, had become a legend among the native tribes. But despite his contributions, image prompt, the windswept Pacific coast. The expedition stares in awe at massive crashing waves under gray skies. Their camp of sodden tents and driftwood shelters hugs the shore. Native Americans barter in the mist, and everyone is wrapped in blankets, gazing toward an uncertain new world. Lewis and Clark. After the journey. Communication between groups was impossible, and Lewis's path turned nearly fatal. In late July, Lewis's group encountered Blackfeet warriors, who at first appeared friendly but grew suspicious when they saw the Americans' firearms and trade goods. One tense night turned deadly. A skirmish broke out and 2 Blackfeet men were killed, the only violent deaths caused by the expedition. Lewis's party fled under cover of darkness, shaken and wounded. Clark's group had a slightly less perilous return, avoiding direct conflict. Back in the east, the news of the expedition's return spread quickly. The journals, maps, plant samples, and ethnographic notes they brought back shaped scientific, political, and popular understanding of the continent for generations. Clark remained involved in Indian affairs and was an influential voice in Western expansion for decades. He named his firstborn son Meriwether Lewis Clark, a tribute to his fallen friend and partner. And what of Sacagawea and York? Sacagawea returned west with her husband and child. Her exact fate is debated, but her symbolic role in American memory only grew. York, Clark's enslaved servant, had become a legend among the native tribes for his strength, resourcefulness, and uniqueness. But despite his contributions, his freedom was a long, bitter struggle. The broader legacy of discovery and empire. The Lewis and Clark expedition marked a turning point in American history. It opened the way for future migration, trade, and, ultimately, conquest. It also revealed the deep complexity and fragility of life on the American frontier, where alliances could turn with a gesture, and survival depended as much on luck and kindness as on strength or ambition. The stories of those who made the journey, leaders, scouts, soldiers, enslaved and free, native and immigrant, became woven into the myth of America's westward expansion. Their triumphs and tragedies shaped not just maps, but imagination. Closing reflections, civilization, survival, and the meaning of cleanliness. As we return from the wilds of the American continent to the winding, muddy lanes of medieval cities, it's worth reflecting on what cleanliness and order meant to different societies. In the Middle Ages, hygiene was a patchwork of improvisation and social signals, as much about appearances as health. In ancient cities, it was engineering, consensus, and ritual. For Lewis and Clark, and those who journeyed with them, survival meant constant adaptation, braving storm, disease, and the unknown, trusting in one another and in the kindness or hostility of strangers. In every age, the lines between filth and virtue, danger and safety, the city and the wilderness, were drawn, erased, and drawn again by the people who walked those streets, sailed those rivers, and dared to imagine something better. Echoes across time. Why cleanliness and cities still matter. The tale doesn't end with explorers or medieval villagers. Across the centuries, the struggles with cleanliness, urban order, and survival have always echoed forward. Cities rise and fall, but the quest for safe water, clean streets, and dignity continues. Modern planners still draw lines, set rules, and debate the balance between health, freedom, and community. People everywhere still wrestle with what it means to be clean or civilized, and how much effort or sacrifice that should require. Just as ancient Mohenjo-Daro mapped drainage under every home, and Babylon raised temples on carefully planned avenues, so do modern cities battle over sanitation systems and social standards. And just as Lewis and Clark depended on knowledge shared by native tribes and travelers before them, so do we build our futures on the lessons and mistakes of those who came before. The universal struggle. Hygiene, identity, and hope. For every society, hygiene is more than a physical act. It's a statement about who we are, who belongs, and what matters. In medieval Europe, it was a symbol of social status, sometimes more display than defense against disease. In ancient cities, it was an engineering marvel, a community achievement, and a sacred ritual. For frontiersmen and explorers, it was often a daily struggle, measured in rations, weather, and luck. But always, behind the rituals and routines, lingered the same questions. How do we keep what's precious safe? How do we share space with others, neighbors, strangers, or travelers passing through? And how do we learn from yesterday's failures to build something cleaner, kinder, and more resilient tomorrow? Closing words. History's gentle reminder. If you're still listening, or reading, let these stories be a gentle reminder. Progress is messy. Cleanliness is a work in progress, and every city, every journey is built on the dreams, compromises, and stubborn determination of countless people you'll never meet. So next time you walk down a paved street, run water from a tap, or step out of a warm shower, remember the medieval villagers dabbing with cloths, the Roman engineers sketching aqueducts, the market sellers in ancient Babylon, and the explorers staring in awe at the Pacific surf. All were striving, sometimes against reason, sometimes with vision, always with hope, to make their world a little safer, a little brighter, a little more their own. Thank you for sharing this journey through history, hygiene, and the stubborn, beautiful persistence of human progress. The circle of story from past to present and beyond. History at its heart is a collection of stories. Some grand, some humble, all interwoven. The tale of hygiene, city building, and exploration is really the story of people trying to shape their world for the better, facing the limits of what they know and can do. Each new city, every journey into the unknown, each ritual of washing and cleaning is a small act of faith that things can improve. It's a hope that future generations will find the world a little safer, a little more comfortable, and perhaps a little more beautiful than the one they inherited. From the muddy alleys of medieval towns to the careful bricks of ancient drains, from imperial Rome's arches to the wild, wind-battered Pacific coast, every age has left behind lessons, some written in stone, some whispered in legend, some carried quietly in the habits of daily life. And you, listening now, are part of that story too. Each time you learn, wonder, care for someone, or dream of building something new, you help carry forward this ancient, restless human hope. That we can shape not just our streets but ourselves, and that we can, together, leave a better world behind. Thank you for journeying through the history of hygiene, city planning, and discovery. A gentle adventure through the ages, all the way to your own doorstep. May your world be a little brighter, your home a little cozier, and your story one of hope, connection, and kindness.